Hello everyone. Now that I've had the 16-inch MacBook Pro for a few weeks now, I think it's time for me to tell you what I've done with the old 2012 Retina MacBook Pro. So what I've decided to do with that machine was that I converted it into my home server of sorts. And along with the decision to make it into a home server, I decided to make a few other additional purchases at the time, which you may have seen in my previous video. So I just want to show you how it's all set up. So first I have the 2012 Retina MacBook Pro here, and it's on top of an old iLap, which has been pretty bent beyond repair. This was originally bought for my very, very, very old 12-inch PowerBook, which was my first ever Mac. And that was definitely a favorite machine of mine. So this is hooked up to a 3rd gen Drobo, which is connected by USB 3.0. So I got this extremely cheaply by a local seller who not only sold me this used Drobo 3rd gen, but also with a full hard disk inside of it, of which I think the majority of them were all WD Reds. I'll show those hard disks later. So on top of that, when I looked around on eBay, I found a Drobo 5 and 2 on sale. So I actually wanted to buy that Drobo 5 and 2 locally, which cost about 3,000 ringgit. Unfortunately, when I initially tried to buy this machine, I couldn't get it because even though I paid for it, apparently they were out of stock. And if you look online, there's a lot of reports about how there's a lot of shortages of Drobo products ever since, well, not just since the COVID period, but it has definitely gotten worse ever since the COVID period. So I found this on eBay. It was sold for actually quite a bit cheaper than that locally. So I decided to get that Drobo 5 and 2. And what I've been using it for is that this has become my new time machine. Now, before I go there, I have to point out that before I used this as my time machine, I was using this Airport Extreme as my time machine backup, as a time capsule. In fact, this was originally a time capsule, but the problem was that some time ago, the hard disk broke down. And what I did was that I simply used a hard disk enclosure to put in a 6 terabyte WD Blue in it, and then I used that as my backup solution. So now that I've had that, I have this Drobo 5 and 2, I've switched over to using the Drobo 5 and 2 as my time machine. So on top of this Airport time capsule, which has now essentially become an Airport Extreme because it no longer has the hard disk inside or attached, I also have this old Airport Extreme, which as you can see, I've actually removed the cover. And the reason why I did that was to simply allow the heatsink to be exposed so that there's much better cooling, because this machine does not have a fan. So it essentially uses convection to cool itself. But obviously in the warm weather of Malaysia, the temperature of the machine is not going to be that cold. It's going to be hot. So this Airport Extreme, on the other hand, does have a fan inside as compared to this one. So I removed this cover just so that it really cools down. And I'll tell you why I've decided to take this out of the closet and use it together with the Airport Extreme. Okay, so there you have it. You have the 2012 Retina MacBook Pro, the Drobo 3rd Gen, the Drobo 5 and 2, and Airport Extreme, the latest one before they stop production, and older generation Airport Extreme. So the reason why I'm using both of these airports is because I've actually basically saturated the Ethernet ports. So what I've not shown you below all these is that I have two printers below. I have one Canon all-in-one and a very old HP all-in-one. So the HP all-in-one printer is actually not used as a printer at all. But what I actually do with it is that I actually scan all my medical notes. I mean, if you have seen my blog, then you know that I actually scan my medical notes, my handwritten notes. And what I use to scan my medical notes is that HP all-in-one 4640. And the reason for that is because that printer actually scans documents much better than that with the Canon all-in-one. The problem with the Canon all-in-one is that with the image that they scan, there's a lot of show-through. So then that becomes a problem when I want to scan my notes, because what I use to write my notes, well, it's a bit excessive, but I actually use Tomoe River paper to write my notes using fountain pens. So even if you try to look at it here, you can probably see that there's definitely some show-through even with some ambient light. So what happens when I use the HP scanner to actually scan my notes is that there is no show-through at all. Now, this is not the case with the Canons. Now, you might call this excessive, expensive, or whatever, but it's just the way how I do things with my medical notes. So, how are the connections between all of this? So the Drobo 3rd Gen is obviously connected to the 2012 MacBook Pro using the USB 3.0. So, and then on top of that, the Retina MacBook Pro is attached to the airport using Ethernet. And then the Drobo 5 and 2 can use two Ethernet connections so that you get better speeds and also better reliability. So it uses two ports. So, and then another, with the USB ports that are available on these airports, I use them to actually connect directly to the two printers. I do this even though these two printers can be used via Wi-Fi. I decided to have them have a wired connection as well, so that there's better reliability and speed. So actually, when I try to have a look here, actually all of the ports are all saturated. So of course, one of the ports is going to be to the modem. So one port from the modem to these routers, and then all the Ethernet cables are all being occupied. So one more Ethernet cable is actually used to go to my bedroom. So that one goes to the bedroom, and I use it to connect directly to my 16-inch MacBook Pro. So with that, I get a direct connection from the computer to the home server network. And therefore, I do not have to rely on slower Wi-Fi speeds. So, of course, I live in a small apartment, and when the kids are not around, then this wired connection from the network to the bedroom is relatively safe. When they are around, obviously, I'll probably have to remove the Ethernet cable to the bedroom and then just use the Wi-Fi connection. But overall, I think it's a pretty good setup. So after this, I'm gonna just show you how exactly on the software side of things I use the home server network. And then lastly, I will tell you about how I actually modified this Retina MacBook Pro so that I can use it as a home server. not just in terms of the software setup, but also what I did to the laptop physically. Because as you can see here, the laptop is actually closed, but it's actually running. And I've made some modifications to really tackle the problem of thermal throttling on this laptop, so that hopefully it gets much more years of use and it doesn't die off because of extreme heat. Because everybody who uses Macs knows that thermal throttling is a real problem because of Apple's preferences for quiet laptops. All right. Okay. So now let's have a look on how the software is set up on my Retina 2012 MacBook Pro. So as you can see here, I've opened up Drobo dashboard on my laptop, which is being displayed on the 2016 MacBook Pro via screen sharing. So that's essentially how I'm controlling that laptop. So I control the 2012 MacBook Pro by using screen sharing via the 2016 MacBook Pro. So I've opened up Drobo dashboard here. So you can see I have the two Drobos, the 3rd gen as well as the 5 and 2. So I put in four hard disks into the Drobo 3rd gen, and as you can see, a lot of them are actually not even more than 1 terabyte. So this is because I've actually decided to basically harvest, if you will, the old hard disk from my previously non-working laptops. So I think this 160 gig was actually so basically these two, the first two, are actually 2.5-inch hard disks, which I've actually used IC dock containers that convert the hard disk to be able to be used as a 3.5-inch disk, which can then be accepted by the Drobo. And the 160 gig, I think, was from that first ever laptop, that 2012 PowerBook G4. And then this 200 gig was from the subsequent 15-inch PowerBook. I can't remember, was it a PowerBook or MacBook Pro? I can't remember, but it was still but it was basically a 2.5 inch hard disk. So this 640 gig hard disk was something that I actually harvested from an apparently still working external hard disk, which was actually probably about 10 years ago, but was no longer used because the storage was small. So I decided to try and harvest it and see whether it could still be usable, and apparently it was still usable. And then this 3 terabyte was the one that I got along with the Drobo from that local seller. So then I have my 5 and 2, and the previous WD Blue that I mentioned before is here, the 6 terabyte, but the rest of the 4 terabyte hard disk here are all from that local seller who sold me the Drobo 5 and 2. And if I'm not mistaken, I think there was only one of them that's a WD green, but then the other two are all WD reds. So they are all NAS drives. So what I do with them is that, so for the Drobo 5 and 2, I actually use this as the main time machine backup. So I actually made a time machine enable share here, and then I added another 3 shares, one for public, one for myself, and then one for my wife to store all her files. So that's what I do with the Drobo 5 and 2. And then along with that, I also have I think a few apps on transmission, while the rest are actually not being used. Initially, I did try to see whether I could use it to log into the Drobo 5 and 2 remotely, but it doesn't seem to be working well at the moment. So I'll have to see whether there's a way to fix it. But at the moment, I don't see the need to access the Drobo remotely. So then what do I do with the third gen? So the third gen is basically just use it as a single drive. And what I do with it is I actually store all of my media files in here. So I actually store all my music files and my photos all in here, and that's how I use cache sharing. I think that's what you call cache server. So basically, I use I use this laptop to store all the podcasts, all my music, as well as all my photos in here, and then it will be shared to all the other computers by acting as a cache server. So as you can see here, I've had this laptop for maybe just a few weeks, but even then you can see that it has already served about 24 gigabytes of data to my other devices, mainly my 16-inch MacBook Pro, as well as my iPhone. So how you want to set up is pretty easy. If you want to use it as a cache server, you just go to sharing and content caching. So with that, it will share files. It will also share installation files as well as iCloud media. So you can even go to your advanced options and you can actually set how much you want. So since for this laptop, I've actually moved all the media to the Drobo. So the hard disk itself has a lot of space, and I use that space to and allocated all that for content caching for all my other devices. So you can see here that it has used about 200 gigs of data for caching, while this laptop itself has about 500 gigs of storage. So, and this is only made possible by the fact that I've moved all my data to the Drobo, and that's because with the Drobo, with the Drobo here, I'm actually able to keep almost 500 gigs of data away from the laptop itself. So these are all of my photos, and these are all of my music, and all of them are attached to the laptop and act as a server to all my other devices as needed. So that's how I set up my Drobo and how I modify my laptop to become the home server. So next, what have I done to the 2012 Retina MacBook Pro itself? So as you can see here, let me just show you. These are original benchmarks that I've done a few weeks ago before I did further modifications on my laptop. And as you can see here, the scores are quite bad actually, because one of the problems with the MacBook Pro is that there's a lot of thermal throttling. And what I did initially was that I tried to just change the thermal paste on the heat sinks for the CPU and the GPU, but apparently that also didn't work. So what I did was that I decided to not just change the thermal paste on the heatsink, but I decided to try to make a connection between the heatsink as well as the aluminum casing itself, so that the aluminum can act as a heatsink. So what I did was that I actually scraped off the thermal insulator portion of the bottom plate of the MacBook Pro, and then I did something even crazier by putting a whole blob of thermal paste, which in my case I was using the Cooler Master Gel Maker thermal paste, and then put so much so that there will be contact between the heat pipe as well as the casing itself. And that actually made a big difference, because as you can see here, this is the original score. Single core of 720, multi-core of 2809. And what happened is that the score would actually get as high as a single core of 755 and a multi-core of 3076. And that is a big jump. And the reason for that big jump is that now it is no longer dependent on the fan itself to bring heat out, but now whatever heat that is on the heatsink will just go straight to the casing. And since the MacBook Pro casing is aluminum, then that itself acted as a heatsink, and that really helped to cool the laptop down. In fact, it cooled the laptop down so much that I was able to get much lower temperatures in general. Let me just show you. Okay, let me just show you here. So you can see here that the temperatures are pretty high, while the temperatures today are pretty low. Now you may think, well, there's not much of a difference there, but actually the main difference is because of the fact that I'm actually able to put lower speeds on the MacBook Pro's fans. So ever since I bought iStat menus, I've actually been using it to make my own custom fan speed. And actually, for the most part, before I changed the thermal paste on the heatsink as well as the casing, I would actually have to put the fans at more or less 4,500 or 5,000 at baseline. And even with that, the CPU will always just jump up to more than 65 whenever I'm actively using it. So, and then for which I've actually put a full blast mode and go all out. So as you can see here, it's actually in full blast, but even when it's in full blast, I'm still getting the turbo boost temperatures, and the temperatures are still not reaching 100 at all, which isn't the case before I made the thermal paste adjustment. So before that, even when I just reach home, I will be hearing the fan of the laptop being on full blast, and that's with me not doing anything with the laptop actively. And now for the past half a day or so, I find that the fans have been pretty quiet when I'm not doing anything with it. Now, right now, it's of course being on full blast because I'm recording it through screen sharing, so it's using quite a bit of the CPU there. And then if you open up the Geekbench page, it actually uses up a lot of the CPU just to open the Geekbench page. So let me just show you how much less CPU will be used if you just go away from it. And there you go. So, and quite interestingly, even the Drobo dashboard page uses actually a lot of the GPU. So one of the other things that I've done to modify this laptop is that I actually changed to always use the GPU. Here. Okay, so I've actually turned off automatic graphics switching. So it's actually always using the graphics card. So mainly, it's not really to actually render anything on the screen because the laptop is turned off, the screen is turned off, but just for any kind of calculations, things like that, I would be using the GPU instead of the integrated graphics. So then the next question is, how exactly am I able to use the laptop with the lid closed? Is that I just use a simple terminal command, caffeinate. So with this command, even caffeinate -s, even when the lid is turned off, then the laptop will still remain running, which is the case right now because you're actually looking at the laptop running. So there you have it. If you have questions, you can ask down below, and maybe I'll tell you more about what I've done and maybe what you may want to suggest that I could probably do with the laptop. Thanks.